Hello everyone, today we make a broader consideration about the Holy Roman Empire that we came to study a bit more in depth in the last months. As you know, I've added this new series that is dedicated to mostly to Germany and Italy during the High Middle Ages, and that so far has brought us to assess some deeper and albeit somewhat also more comprehensive sometimes, like today's videos, uh, aspects of Holy Roman Imperial power and what this came to be, right? And it's always a fascinating topic. I see that often when I talk about it, not just I get an important amount of views at the moment from my subscribers, but also there are lots of people attracted from the outer space, specifically to these videos, and it's really one topic that really today it's a relaxing video. I'm not going to make a broader, let's say, detailed thing like we will do in the future for your great joy about in fact lots of aspects that are economical, juridical, territorial, of course always political in nature, but connected to, in the case especially of the German kingdom, to essentially a regional, regionalistic, if you prefer, power that, as you know, evolved historically into, in fact, essentially a federal reality, albeit connected always by this super structure that was trying to still claim that universal capacity that for a time, for a while, especially in the second half of the 12th century, was literally the strongest power in Europe, and that before and afterwards, was somewhat swinging, and especially later on declining, properly in its centralized nature. It was hoping to transform itself, and this dynamic encompasses a broader set of considerations on the nature of the German kingdom, why it underwent this process, why essentially a national monarchy failed, unlike countries like England or France, but also others that in the even in the East were more compact, right? They had, territorially speaking, politically maintained a greater unity, right? Not necessarily a greater strength or expansionistic capacity, but definitely a unit that was capable of, even from within the same Holy Roman Empire. Think about the Bohemia of Ottokar II. Permisled, and were capable of directioning their control, or the whole country, or at least those kingdoms eventually transformed themselves into elective monarchies themselves on the long run, something that the German one had already been for centuries, and this surely wouldn't help a further development. But at a point, surely, a power like Poland and Lithuania, for example, even in the early modern period, were a hell of a power, even compared to the Habsburgs times. So it's different worlds, and Germany is a European exception in this regard, because it's difficult to find there isn't any of this elsewhere in terms of a country that was kind of born as an elective monarchy, right? Which was originally a Germanic thing, because even the Kingdom of France, initially the Kingdom of Italy, so basically the post-Carolingian kingdoms, were based on the idea that yes, there was an emperor, and there was over all these kingdoms, and eventually the local kings were recognized as a public authority, but fundamentally there wasn't much of a of a dynastic linearity in the way they found their stabilization. But in theory, this monarchy had always been elected, right? It had always this is a broader, not just Germanic, but even Roman legacy. I mean, the fact that even the Roman Empire didn't quite have really a dynastic principle of succession in nature, right? Of course, there was not formalized, it's not institutionalized, and the idea was that the broader Indo-European background that, of course, the rulers were such only because when they were recognized essentially by the community that could confer them an imperium, and this is basically the whole ideology around which revolves all the enormous issues of the Renovatio Imperii per se, right? Because the fascinating thing about about Germany in that regard is that these guys were, first of all, the least developed of the post-Carolingian kingdoms, but the ones that actually came not just to revive, but to monopolize the imperial title, which is really a big deal. You know that there were emperors coming, that were, as soon as as long as they were elected by the papacy, there were Italian emperors, Provençal emperors. Later on, even think about the Luxembourgs as French rulers of a Slavic country like Bohemia. But fundamentally, the imperial history heads towards this idea that not just the Holy Roman Empire was centered in Germany, in its policy, in its institutions, in its formalizations, were very gradually sanctioned, basically just up to the mid-14th century. This wasn't very much stable as a system, but even before, the validity was somewhat realistically connected with this, in fact, universality of the various princes, but it became properly in the official titling later on Holy Roman Empire of the Germanic nation, and whatever even there actually meant, because at that point the empire had, German monarchy had essentially collapsed. So there were, we're in the princely phase in German history where there were essentially some great houses essentially contending as private dynasties at that point, but still contending that public, if you want at that point, ideal institutional reality, right? We're talking about the Habsburgs and then the Luxembourgs, the Wetten, the Wittelsbach, the Hohenzollern, and so on. And that remained, in a sense, recognized as, however, still as such, right? This up to secularization and the Age of Enlightenment. There was also kind of a lot of criticism, not mockery, right? Criticism had always happened. We made a video last summer. I don't remember the title exactly. It was Holy Roman Empire. There is a playlist on the Holy Roman Empire on Schwerpunkt. Ideology, policy, and foreign relations, something like that. And even, by centuries like the 12th, the 13th, so the acme of German power was properly the reflection of what and why this thing had to be properly as a German monopolium. What was even there the ambiguity? You see, the empire per se had to be universal, right? But factually, we're talking at that point of this essentially German, Italian, and partly essentially Bohemian, Slavic to Bohemian, mostly, not only, and some partly French territory that was a sort of this axis, latitudinally stretching from northern to southern Europe, and excluding a lot of other Roman Catholic countries. That is to say, France, and especially we're talking about the post-Carolingian kingdoms, any kingdom that had somewhat owed a sort of recognition to the empire, which was the case even, for countries like Denmark or the Western Slavic monarchies, or even England at some point, right? That for political convenience recognized this high-sounding Roman imperial title, etc. But they were factually excluded. Like, pick France. France by the 13th century would become more powerful than Germany at that point, and still by the 16th century you have, a sovereign like Francis the First that is effectively about to buy the German monarchy instead of Charles of Habsburg, and that would have been feasible, but let's say nobody had quite managed to even realistically assessed, let's say, the possibility of reincluding France within the empire, whereas the thing had been done with Italy, importantly enough, so much that, albeit incorrectly from a historiographical point of view, people say, the Holy Roman Empire was born in 962 because of, Otto the First crowning. This idea of fixing, dates and it's a bit the legalistic point that, this is entirely historiographical in a sense. And it even makes sense for didactic purpose in a way, but what we don't reflect really much is the nature of the empire in itself, right? What it should have been in theory, because nobody at the time thought that the Holy Roman Empire had been born, right? The empire had always been, factually, at least the one stemming from the Carolingian Franks, right, which also brought to some issues within the same Saxony at the time of the Romanization of the title, because up to that point, fundamentally, that had been a Frankish empire, had been recognized as such, even by the Byzantines, right? Who cared just about saying that those were not Romans, right? As long as but Imperium was recognized. This was a deep thing because all these peoples north of the Alps that had come to monopolize effectively the Western rule, independently from the ruinous collapse of the Carolingian Empire, the fact that up to Henry the Fowler, in fact, properly the Ottonians, there hadn't been quite been a power as such, but there is also the German interregnum in the second half of the 13th century, and there are these swings and phases, but we also tend to. It was the single empire, right? And what they were debating at that point was mostly the Romanity of it, right? So passing from, let's say, an idea that there is a people that wins the imperium, that is the faculty to command, to say, okay, no, we have to emulate specifically the Roman Empire, and all the problems at that point were deriving because of the ambiguity, if you want, that still was out there across Europe and the Mediterranean of, what is the papacy doing? Right, because at that point, that the empire, as such, was a papal creation, and that that it wasn't clear at that point what Romanity concretely meant in a world that was even witnessing the ever greater detachment of the Western and Eastern churches, the fact that Rome was Rome and it was factually outside the Byzantine Empire, even though even there is an ambiguity, because the papacy, just like Venice, there is not really a moment where said, okay, we secede, we're not part of what we call the Byzantine Empire. It was never such a thing, because of course it was very convenient to be at the center of these two powers. The papal ideology still by the 11th century was pretty much by the 10th, 11th century, Ottonian times, to be right with let's say the idea that they were at the head of both of the empires. And as you know, these are all problems that we have already discussed here and there. We made videos on the Lazio Imperium, so I don't want to digress too much on them. But I'd say recently, of course, we'll talk about that too. But recently, I've gotten more interested in what the empire not should have really been in terms of because there were things that were not even properly explained at the time, right? Certain what the prevalent ideology of the Holy Roman Empire per se was, we don't quite understand, right? And simply because the sources of the time are ambiguous, because the imperial ideology fundamentally was formulated by certain, minds, great minds of the time, were often chancellors of the emperors, were in part the result the struggle for investitures that brings from the papal side also a definition of what they thought the empire should be, and something back and forth. There is the reinjection of Roman law that we discuss very often on Schwerpunkt, that at that point was significantly in favor of instead the secular power of the empire. And there are many other issues that actually we've never discussed in detail, that are, for example, the struggle between papacy and empire properly on the juridical possession and political recognition at that point of certain lands, specifically in Italy as such. For example, a mistake that is usually done, that is not entirely such, but it's important to stress in perspective, is considering, for example, the Roman Church as like a physical part of the Holy Roman Empire. This is something that I believed for years, meaning saying, the Holy Roman Empire was factually encompassing also, central Italy, right? The borders of the empire in the Italic kingdom at a point even went past beyond the stripe of papal territory that stretches essentially from Rome up to Ravenna, and think about the Duchy of Spoleto, for example, is so as a landmass, independently from the intermittent and mostly really weak control that emperors had on those territories properly from a concrete point of view in the first place. You would imagine that these were all together, right? Instead, the church thought something completely different. That is, the church is completely detached from any secular power. That is to say, all the lands and properties that land owned at that point were something extra terrene in a way. It's like the concept that existed at the root of monasticism, that the idea that the monastery had to represent the heavenly Jerusalem on earth, the perfection of the heavens, and therefore it was also couldn't quite be violated, right? Because it would have been sacrilegious, because that was literally God's possession. I was about to say space, given our current political debate, but concretely, it was a big deal, right? So it was something that went far beyond just a mere, say, political or juridical capacity. It had to do with certain ideologies that were, in a sense, greater than the same powers that were pioneering them at the time, but that at the same time dramatically contributed to Western development of Western civilization. I mean, if the investiture controversy had not existed, but we wouldn't have a modern Europe as we intend it right now, right? The civilizational booster deriving from papacy and empire struggling together, it's at the root of some of the greatest theological, political, theoretical, juridical, and developments in the Western world. So there are naturally different perspectives. There are people I'm tendentially pro empire. Right? I of course the two things had always to coexist, but the idea of a state, right, that has to control publicly, right, and to maintain a durable control. But I'm also pro church, consistently seeing what the church managed to achieve, even here, civilizationally, and in a sense more than the empire, because the empire remained, if you want, as we were saying before, essentially a Germanic thing, while the papacy at that point had really managed to encompass politically, administratively, with its possessions, with its properties, with its political influence, the whole Western world, right? And it was bringing there an enormous cultural legacy from all the deep, say, developed background and it was stemming from, right? So when you go look again in depth at what was going on at the time, you realize that as everything it's political in nature, right? All this was being done as a struggle for power. I understand for part of, possibly even of my audience and experience before, there is this. You see that there is a reason. I'm sorry that Clausewitz and videos are at the moment to a halt, but I'm just changing some things. We will complete that, but properly the totalizing understanding of how politics controls the entirety of human experience is it should be the ABC of every historical understanding, right? Some people cannot just accept. I see, especially at the beginning when I made these videos were more about political theory or history or religion, or people just cannot accept something that is inherent in the same Bible. For example, is to say everything you do is political, right? And the religious is always it's meant to be political because it's meant to be about individual responsibility and what is called there as a sort of division from, say, or separation or conceptual as it is between, the secular and the spiritual world is actually a conceptual one. It's a theoretical one that must exist, but obviously overlaps at all given time in the world. Otherwise, there wouldn't be even a physical reality for mankind to, to live and make use of the faculties that God has endowed them with. So this was deeply felt at the time, that more than anything else, right? This was if you want, still a chaotic civilization. When the Middle Ages are a very peculiar time in history, because hardly from being there any chaos in the, let's say, in the illogical sense of it. There was, however, a rampant explosion, essentially, of booming, essentially, of an enormous amount of communities were trying essentially their best, their own way, and they all brought something different. This lays at the roots of Western civilization. That is, other cultures, even within the same continent or Mediterranean, weren't quite the same as the West, right? And they were to lag behind, right? Europe didn't have past, the moment of Islamic invasions overstretching and this temporary threat of the Mongols basically remained forming on its own, right? It's something that went on without needing to essentially to struggle against an external pressure. It simply boomed and overflowed as a model. Even we've described this so many times, basically in all the surrounding space, right? And the Holy Roman Empire is part of this, is part of in fact, property of a German, mostly at least, German-based experience of Eastern Frankish, if you prefer. Germany wasn't even, in fact, it was expanding in this country, in this period. It was, dialects increased, the great part of the Western Slavic world was even encompassed by this, with evident consequences even to this day. So I'm not making much of a national point, but rather the fact that there is this geographical area of Europe that had always remained, if you want, a hybrid of the two main situations of the continent, right? From one side, the Romance, urbanized, literate, administratively developed, kind of professionally oriented from a military point of view, reality, and then the Germanic Slavic one, was not urbanized. It had less populace. Was less connected. It was illiterate. It had and that was gradually, even there, however, absorbed by, in fact, the first model was essentially what we call, truly in a sense, a Western one, in the narrower sense of the term, but it's particularly spot on, right? And the history of, especially the Carolingian Empire, in my opinion, is deeply the connection of this. Not because these two areas were literally homogeneous between each other. You can argue that, France was a hybrid, even in there, between, the standards of Italy and the standards of Germany, right? So, but Germany is, in between these two broader models, something unique in kind. You don't quite see the same, even today, right? If you pick the modern country of Germany, aside from its development in the last 200 years, especially with the unification, with the put in motion of these important resources that made of Germany, actually, the most important country in Europe, by the way, with enormous blows that the country took even itself. So, for essentially, by the way, its own fault at the end of the day. But still, with this enormous expansionist capacity, it's something very different from other Germanic countries, right? Wherever you want to set the boundaries. Scandinavia is not like that. England and broadly speaking, the UK, of course, it's not like that. There is a federal nature still in the German constitution with the land, with the this hierarchy of the these levels of jurisdictions, etc. That is very reminiscent of that medieval past. I mean, Germany is the country that, even when it was conquered by Napoleon, was not really turned into the Jacobean kind of statalist system that you find replicated, from France and Italy, in the Iberian Peninsula, etc. No, but even Napoleon said, Germany functions better if you, very pragmatically, if you still leave partly of this hybrid between modernity and ancien regime, right? And this had always been the case, and it's somewhat remarkable in nature, and therefore you find this utter exception, that is an imperial title connected essentially to one country, that, however, is evidently running short of expectations, but at the same time it's still recognized internationally. It's still provided with that idea of not much of leadership of the other ones, but rather the fact that if there had to be a secular power, this laid in the essentially in the Germanic Empire for some reason, mostly for tradition, objectively, but not quite if you consider what the origins of the empire had been, because again there had been non-German emperors back in the day, even within the same so-called Holy Roman Empire, which at the time wasn't even called like that, talking about the 10th, 11th century, and the and still, right, in fact, up to the 19th century, this thing existed as at that point as quite burdensome, but still relic essentially of a different past. And we could go on other broader perspectives, maybe even to closer times, but what is fascinating is trying to understand how the thing came about properly in the Middle Ages, right? Diversity is an important character there. If you see the evolution of dialects, for example, within the same kingdom of Germany, that especially in the east, as you know, literally expanded, you see essentially a multiplication of languages at this time. There is hardly an homogenization. There is not such a thing like, and this is still very felt in the modern Germany, even Austria, that or Switzerland, whether they like it or not. It's as if they are Deutsche their own way, right? So because they were, right, even in part the Netherlands, that are actually the only true case of secession from the Holy Roman Empire, right? In de facto historical, but much later, from compared to the Middle Ages, but still there is this idea of severe diversity and properly of different identity within the same Germany, within this Central European world. And it's worth noticing, because at the time it was particularly felt, that is, when you look at the expansion of urban and rural economies, the reforms of jurisdiction, the rise of territorial lordships, these were remaining fundamentally based on regionalism, right? This changed maybe nature over time. There are these so-called ethnic duchies that were reflecting essentially the let's say the ethnic identity of the older gentes inhabiting Germany, even before the Frankish colonization, conquest, etc., and that remained somewhat also for concrete reasons, like the fact that Germany, for example, was still a very inhospitable land for a long time, right? Germany was starting to be properly fully colonized, feudalized, and settled the way it is between the second half of the 12th and the 13th century, where you can see it in art, right? This was a more archaic country than France. It was properly lagging behind, but still, as we have seen, having managed to monopolize that kind of imperial title, independently from the power properly of its own monarchs, right? And this is also the thing. And what is fascinating here is that regionalistic development had always coexisted with the attempts of establishing properly a central rule, right? To independently from what the German monarchs did, essentially these German communities on their own would essentially improve their own situation, would expand, would build, would consolidate. This is something you find also in other regions of the empire, right? Think about the Kingdom of Italy with the city-states and humanism. Even the same Duchy and eventually Kingdom of Bohemia that in itself developed literally as a kingdom within. At that point, yes, it's the Holy Roman Empire, but it's as if it had been an appendix of Germany by certain standards, and even managing to become the most powerful entity within the same area by the 13th century, so the late 13th century, and this tells you how. And as we were saying before, right, we are analyzing the history, if you want, of a failure, right? Not just of the German monarchy per se, but factually of both of the imperial and papal powers, right? By the mid 14th century, exactly when in Germany the kind of national character of the empire was reasserted. There was properly the fixation of some of those 7 electors, institutionally speaking. That was the time of greater contraction of imperial and papal power, right? That was a mess, let's be honest, and Europe was in crisis. These were not the only lands that were affected by that, but it's still remarkable that in spite of that, right, from when you see the broader evolution, for example, of science, by 1500, effectively the most technologically advanced countries in Europe are Germany and Italy. And these were all fragmented. The Italians had something like 30 states on their own, the Germans like 300. So they were hyper-fragmented lands. And so, nevertheless, they developed and they put out an enormous civilizational, output properly. And by the Renaissance, I don't even need to explain how much true this is. But compared to France, which was at the time the strongest power in Europe, France was different. And in part because it had concentrated power, had always maintained this more kind of truly imperialistic, imperialism. Like Germany, yes, was imperialistic in the sense that, at some point it kind of tried to be imperialistic in nature, but that's essentially the point. Those communities didn't quite agree, right, with that, because having an empire means that you have to contribute to it, especially in terms of military force, and that was the greatest problem of German monarchs throughout all the time. The French, properly the northern French, had instead, since Frankish times, properly a radically violent imperialistic mindset, which is, by the way, a positive thing, right? The idea of properly having the consciousness, the awareness, the confidence of your own capacity, of your initiative, of your aggressiveness is what makes basically almost at all times in history the difference between victory and defeat, right? And naturally, this is not just a mindset, but that helps, right? The French had never gotten over that. There are lots of reasons. That's because the lands had developed more feudalism and cavalry, and this idea that there was properly an elite and aristocracy that was more powerful than anything else. That's how France, in a modern sense, was born, right? And France easily is among the European countries definitely the most, except Russia perhaps, but the most imperialistic in nature, right? Properly in the deepest veins of its own political culture, right? And again, it's actually a positive thing. As a European, I'm happy that France has this mentality, because it's in part what we lack in other countries, to have properly an idea of what's your role within the world, and how you should be respected and maintain your own interests, and having even a hell of a military power capacity. The French have the bomb just like the British. But the question is that there must be in a concrete way, this is a Clausewitzian concept, naturally, a decisive moral push, right, towards for achieving something, right? You must, in order to lead, to command. If you're talking about an empire, right, and half of of the country rose backwards because essentially they're not interested. Like most Germans were not interested in the Raumfahrt, in the Mediterranean dream, in the romanity of the empire. They just wanted to mind their own business, right? Because these were areas that had always been kind of private lordships, had never been framed properly within the idea of a state or something that would work essentially outside of the private privileges. They had always wanted to remain on their own, and when it was possible, of course, to seize more power at the expense of the public authority. I mean, imperial rights were sacked all throughout this time. By the mid 13th century, the collapse of the German had already began. Right, it began with in favor and Principum, that is, with Frederick II properly ruling from Sicily, said, okay, the hell with that. Even though he believed deeply and he took his role of German king very seriously, in Germany he started basically open to literally to the princely phase. That is to say, even as an emperor, as a public authority, he began to sell imperial rights in exchange for power that he would use to consolidate essentially a private private possession. I mean, the Hohenstaufen were based in Swabia. Their main goal was essentially to seize Austria from the Babenberg. That Austria at some point, that dynasty extinguished. So everybody wanted to grab it. First the Bohemians achieved, then the Habsburgs would, and that's by how they rose to power in Austria. But the idea was essentially Swabian Austria, not just because southern Germany was richer than northern Germany, except the Rhineland. So it's mostly, as always, southwestern Germany versus northeastern Germany. That was the divide we were talking about before between the more civilized lands, if you want. If anything, because they had been Romanized, because they had been Frankicized, and they were more productive in themselves. And the others, of course, for ensuring the Alpine pass into Italy, that again was all part of the Swabian policy and strategy, as you know, and ruling from Italy, because at that point, really, Frederick, that had been the deal with the Ottonians as well. Of course, they would have their dream was essentially to rule from Rome, because that's what a Roman emperor does, and Germany being just a peripheral province of the empire. That was the universalistic dream. It was actually the most sensible thing to do, right, independently from what 19th century German nationalistic historiography believed, trying to incensing, the Welfen in Saxony to expand instead towards the north, east in the truer Germanic direction. Those Swabians were running after the Mediterranean chimera, and they lost all the empire, and everything was so bad because the Germans wouldn't have their own king. What actually the Hohenstaufen were doing was the best thing, of course, because also whoever essentially seized power. We made a video in their stead. I mean, we made a video on Otto IV of Brunswick, from opposing that policy. Once they were on the throne, they would pursue the same, because of course it was the most sensible thing to do. The greater wealth, the greater power was in the south, was in the centralized structures of the papacy, of the Italian city-states in the Kingdom of Sicily. Constantinople went that close to be reconquered by Henry VI if he had not died, there would have been properly a reunification, like a Latin Empire, actually not French-based, but German-based, right? And that's how fast things could have changed, right? If there hadn't been a Legnano, for example, very likely the history. I'm not saying that there would have literally been the reunification of East and West. There might have been, we just don't know, or how permanent that would have been. But surely history as we know it, Europe as we know it, would have been very, very, very different. And today we're not going to explain how and why these things happen concretely, but rather reflecting briefly on the, let's say, of what this meant for, mostly for imperial power to consist of, right? What is from that we don't frankly know about their perspectives. They were always politically mediated in the way they were expressed, and therefore we can't quite see exactly in the from, if you want, the mindset of the various rulers. If not, of course, certain things we do understand very clearly also about what the idea was, right? Always remember this was a very archaic time, especially high medieval times, still by the 12th to 13th century. And I would say especially in a country like Germany, the mindset was still very much exalted. We can see this in favor of the idea of the empire, right? That became almost a sort of national trait, right? The idea was that these people had been somewhat elected among the others by God to control all others. And so this is in fact what rose perplexity. In other countries that were also frankly more functional from an institutional point of view, political point of view, but that also reckoned in this century's German power in itself. And kingship here is crucial, right? We don't have just to think of, you see, in theory, in the empire, everybody could become emperor, right? Hell, at some point, even a Castilian became king of the Romans. We made those examples before, but in fact, the institutional ether through which this thing had to operate was still German channeled, right? The idea is that normally, you see, the German kingship was not really connected to any imperial path, right? But there was the fundamental one. Instead, was the Roman kingship. The kings of the Romans were elected traditionally in Aachen, because that had been the ancient Carolingian capital that had to emulate Rome in a sense, and that would confer to the elected this essentially status of would-be emperor that eventually had to be properly consecrated in Italy, not just by the Pope, but properly by, the Italians, as we were saying before, in an elective sense, ideally, with the Italic crown, right, of Pavia. This is important because it is the Italic crown that was actually connected to the imperial title. This is another thing, that the Italic crown, like the Burgundian one, fundamentally was an aborted one, right? The Italians didn't elect kings later than the 11th century, right? Nevertheless, the Germans recognized that in order to be crowned emperors, they had to be necessarily Italic kings, right? And this is something that even why this? Because from their own perspective, before we were stating the papal one, but from the imperial one, indeed, the church, Rome, as properly as a city, so spatially, territorially fit, what was part of the Italic kingdom. Hence, they couldn't. This title had been associated to the imperial one since the time of Charlemagne, and this is quite important to stress also how much the Carolingians, since back in the day, had attributed importance to the Italic kingdom, and in fact, it's not a surprise again that Otto III would go to live in Rome, or Frederick II preferred to rule from not from the Kingdom of Italy, but still from the south, from the Mediterranean, rather than, and namely, yes, also as Italic king, ideally, just, there was the Lombard League in the middle that had something to say about that, but that recognized this what had been, if you want, the true Romanity. The idea that Rome was south of the Alps, that the Germanic emperors were not reigning on their own over Europe from north of the Alps. No, there had to be this special sanction, especially from the hands of the papacy, but that were Roman hands. So much that, as also in the crowning ritual in Rome, it wasn't just about the papal crowning, but actually the election, means the consent, the applauding, the approval of the Roman people. That is to say, in the church, properly, the Roman people had to manifest its own approval of the German ruler. Otherwise, and there were many instances in which, in fact, the Roman people wasn't quite from the side of the Germans in that occasion. There were, urban battle. Rome had some of the most tormented military histories during the Middle Ages, you can imagine, but still, because it was effectively an important center, that still had something to say about properly the Romanity of its nature, right? So the idea of Romanity was, in a sense, being abstracted from previous times, because it was now attached to, legalistically, if you want, a bit like in the Byzantine fashion now, to properly that type of empire, right? Whereas in practice, like the Romanity should have been no more nor less than, I don't know, the Frankity or the Saxonity of the empire in itself, given that, according to the archaic Roman ideal, the imperium was a universal thing, a universal power endowed by the celestial deity of the sky, and of war, therefore, to this or that people, right? So instead, there is, if you want, a Byzantine influence here that was what the Byzantines were, in fact, guarding dramatically, as you know, and that the Germans themselves could never quite internationally boast, because they recognized in a way that it was properly their Romanity by law. That is to say that the Roman Empire still existed factually in the Byzantine one. In fact, they are the same thing, and that by law no emperor could be elected if not by the hand of another emperor. Well, it always struck me how effectively the Holy Roman Empire went down that path itself, albeit it had factually, or maybe this is exactly the point, it didn't quite have factually fully, the imperium itself, the military power itself. I mean, since Roman times, nobody had ever seen something like the Carolingian Empire, right? So that was a factual power. That's also why the Byzantines, they recognized the imperial title, but not the Roman one. And how, however, especially with the Ottonians, from this Germanicity of the empire, there is the passage to the Romanity of the empire. This is important because across Europe, there was kind of a discrimination on an ethnic base, right? Even the same, if you pick the imperial ambassador, Liutprand of Cremona, this is one of the most famous historiographers of the time. There is the famous embassy in Constantinople. This was a man of the Ottonians, right? This was essentially, what was he? He from Cremona in Lombardy, so he was essentially an Italian at the time, right? Spoke Romance, was, but there is a phrase in this work that says explicitly that speaking, which never happened really, because this would have the scene again in front of Nicephorus in Constantinople, the Byzantine emperor, that said something contemptuous such as, we, as Longobards, as Liutprand was in that sense, because the Italic kingdom was still effectively the Longobard one, even in post-Carolingian times. So we Longobards, Bavarians, Saxons, Franks, Burgundians, etc., every time we see a Roman, we say, every time we want to insult somebody, we address him like, oh, you Roman, right? Because the Romanity there was felt as in a national sense, right? And with such a pride that you understand a guy living in northern Italy, essentially, the country had not been Germanized ethnically, right? If anything, however, it had been Germanized culturally. For these people to believe that they were, in a sense, the Westerners that had recovered the empire by themselves, and that therefore loathed the Romans as the weak ones and corrupted ones, and all the stereotypes that still that perpetrated themselves for many reasons, in part in anti-Byzantine sense, but sometimes even in Protestant times against the Catholics, and all this idea that the Northerners are better, right, and do it better. But this for saying how deep, however, was still the ethnic pride associated to the concept of empire itself. And kingship here was effectively the only way that was the primigenial political title that could measure the power of a ruler, right? So there were, as we've seen, these levels: first king of something, most likely of Germany, historically speaking, then king of the Romans, and Holy Roman Emperor, whatever. So kingship was crucial, because the Germanity of, as we've seen, the empire was associated to this title of king of the Romans, that, as we've seen, was mostly monopolized by the Germans. And in order to achieve that, you would have had to be German king in the first place, so much that normally the election was coincident, right, or at least was very happening a very short time distance, right? As there might have been elected German kings in, I don't know, in Frankfurt, in Mainz, I don't know, somewhere else, and then going to Aachen in a few weeks, hopefully, with all the problems that existed there in terms of armed retinues blocking the roads or the city itself, all these things, and being elected king of the Romans. So kingship here was crucial. There was a charismatic character, a sacral one, right? Especially after the country naturally was fully Christianized in the German rule, right? As we have seen, most Germans didn't quite like this, right? They weren't. Northeastern Germany especially was not just the least cooperative in that regard, but also the one with factually the same southwestern kings would say, okay, you know what, we don't care, as long as we control the Rhineland and the Alpine passes and we can't go into Italy, we'll do our own business, especially with ecclesiastical retinues. And because most of the armies that descended in the Rhonfart were, this is famous, like you've seen Barbarossa's time, were mostly ecclesiastical ones, because as we've seen, the great ecclesiastical electors by that point were mostly pro-royal, differently from the secular ones who were a bit less, in fact, cooperative. So there was, so German kingship per se was a quite delicate affair, not just because it was elected, and because, as you know, there was this succession of dynasties, factually, the Ottonians, the Salians, the Swabians, etc. And so hardly such a strong continuity like when you see, I don't know, with the Capetians, for example. And this was due also to the difference between the Western and the Eastern Frankish political structures, the fact that feudalism, as we were saying before, arrived later in Germany, and this, so even dynastization, reflected this, being essentially weaker in the East, and so on. But more than that, what really arrived as a storm in all these matters was as a crisis, the Gregorian reform, right? And so all the issues that, as you know, we made videos about this, we'll keep making them, about the struggle over the investitures of, essentially, of both lay and ecclesiastical offices, right? Who did have to decide that, right? And eventually the thing was settled in Worms. It was mostly about the church, frankly, but essentially it was this temporary split. The Pope would have essentially the Italic ones, and the Emperor the German ones. But even in there, the thing was much more complicated, and the attritions and contrasts and open warfare didn't surely stop there. But this was a problem for German kings, because the popes had, from, say, as a weakness, the fact that, albeit being a territorial power, were not particularly strong. So the Germans often could, march on Rome. But the papacy had this enormous moral strength and spiritual, authoritativeness, for which we were explaining it even the other day, that video about the Avignonese papacy. The fact that it wasn't really a territorial power. We could literally claim that kind of spiritual power it objectively had, quite evenly from a political point of view. On the other hand, the German weakness was in fact the same structure of the German kingdom, and the fact that every time the Pope excommunicated the emperor, in the sense the German king in these cases, the country would revolt. Not just the country, but properly the sovereign would have been internationally isolated, would be excruciating problems. And as you know, the thing was pretty much intense, especially at the time of Barbarossa, but especially of his grandson Frederick II, with Gregory IX, in a sense the fourth, attacking the emperor. So the German kingship at that point became an ambivalent symbol, because from one side, as we've seen, a lot of vassals would say simply, okay, you are excommunicated. Now I am morally free to ravage all the public lands, to weaken your power, to disobey you, whatever. This was all intertwined with papal international policy, so it's not so simple. But a lot of people would actually stick to the emperor, and this is remarkable, because there were moments of deep crisis, like the one of Henry IV, for example, where literally, that's the lowest that royal power would ever touch. In a way, these are all things that we will see in detail at some point, because none of these interpretations is really so simple as it sounds. But from another side, there would be lots of people who, in fact, as we were saying, stuck to the emperor because they recognize, I would say in a civilizational sense, the importance of leadership, right? And what the imperium was meant to be, as we will see better at the end of this video, is to say, this wasn't like, independently from this mechanistic thing of the various crowns, the titles, etc. At the end of the day, the Germans who believed in the monarchy, for whichever interest belief they had, of course attributed to it a sort of privileged character, whether it was ethnic or religious or military, all one, right? They said, we are the ones who must do this, and essentially the popes are attacking us unfairly, those are the heretics, so they will always go against back and forth, right? But what is remarkable in this, that in spite of being an elective monarchy, of not having really a grip on the country, of being excommunicated with this important political crisis, the German monarchy survived. This is not something we have to give for granted, right? Okay, it was maybe not really, it was never a point where this could be wiped out, of course. But if you want that collapse that we assist to in practice during the interregnum in the 13th century, it could have happened also in other moments, right? There were some hard moments that defined Eastern Frankish history, even the same rise of the Imperium, right? We were making that video response the other day, last week, about for example, the Magyar raids in Germany at the time that triggered the rise of the Ottonians themselves properly as a military power, because the Germans that really didn't like to have a single ruler, but at a certain point were tired of Magyar incursions and stuck together largely against this threat. But even at that time, the eastern part of Germany, the one, on the Slavic frontier, the Magyar frontier, the least developed areas of Germany, those were not to be, we don't have to give for granted, would have stabilized, that they would have necessarily, that the system would have made it, right? So it is remarkable how the Methodist still is managed in a country that, as we've seen, wasn't particularly developed at this point by European standards, but had all these difficulties, but managed to keep together the decisive moral strength to go on and to continue keeping essentially the monopolium of the imperium. And this is all really remarkable. So kingship was accepted essentially as a representation, as a communitary representation. The idea that it was properly a communion, a union, an integrity, a cohesion around it that went beyond the more trivial aspects. So this is important because in all the perspective, it's as if the empire had functioned alongside the Christian church, right? There was always this problem in the secular and the ecclesiastical that were always overlapping, right? And the same reason why the struggle for investors happened in the first place. It couldn't be really a Christian society without the church really being present at every level of that community, right? But still there was the sense that the monarchy was operating in a competitive, at least, way with the same church, right? Because it was essentially a struggle over, in fact, the investitures, that is to say, with concrete power, would rule in the empire. And as I understand, it was a draw, because nor the papacy nor the empire at the end of the day prevailed, right? They essentially set the Alps as a watershed most of the times. Yes, they always compenetrated each other. It was a deep connection between Germany and Italy at that point. But it wasn't. There was never like these two powers were never enough to overwhelm each other. Right. There were moments, of course, in that history where they went very close. The same Gregorian Reformation had occurred because of the Ottonian accomplishment of that dream, that is, albeit having a very unstable control all over the empire. However, they had managed to control the church in part, right, and to at least appoint the popes and most of the ecclesiastical offices. There wasn't even really much of a different way that could be thought at the time, right? The Gregorian reform was one of the true, real revolutions in history that simply came not really out of the blue, because there were specific causes and some very long-term ones, including the same ideology of purification that the Ottonians had brought about in order to justify their interference within ecclesiastical policy. But literally, yes, even in there, we don't have to give it for granted. It was invented between the second half between the end of the 11th and the beginning of the 12th century, in ways that were not necessarily to happen had history gone in a different way. Really, the balance could have so easily changed that it's almost embarrassing, right? What was the whole deal with the empire? Well, of course, it was it was a serious one, right? From the imperial point of view, it was properly to protect the church, right? And the church had naturally to protect Christendom, right? In a moral sense, in a spiritual sense. Also from the evils of the world that the secular power that the empire represented could manifest, right? But they were all working, as all people at the time, properly for the salvation of mankind, right? The ultimate goal of the empire was essentially protecting the flock, not just spiritually, but sword in hand. So exercising justice alongside Christian moral principles, right? So there was a very specific nature, a sacral nature of German kingship that at this point was through which, in fact, properly the German kings were identified at that point, because their figure, that even with all their ambiguity of why Germany or why that specific limit of the empire, doesn't matter, but they came to be viewed at the time essentially as the terrestrial vicars for Christ the King, right? So in the biblical kingship, And this is an old thing, right? It was not starting just with the High Middle. It had always been there. Any Christian ruler had always kind of embraced that. Not just also the Old Testamentary models, the Carolingian Empire in terms of monarchic models and properly broader spirituality. It was more essentially Jewish than else, right? Charlemagne was obsessed with David, with properly the violence of the Old Testament, the war, the God, the Lord God of war, and etc. was always exalted. The bloody, the Frankish hematophilia, right? There's properly a people devoted to bloodshed by vocation, properly as militarymen, as imperial commanders. That was their deal, and naturally by the High Middle Ages, also the philosophical and exegetical perspectives had been refined, mostly during Ottonian times, where the court, the intelligentsia was much more refined than the Carolingian one, and this idea of properly of being a terrestrial vicar for Christ the King was brought up by Archbishop Aribo of Mainz as early as 1024, right? For Conrad II. We made some months ago a video about the empire at the time of Conrad II, quite generic, but nevertheless, 2024 is an early date, right? The Ottonian dynasty had just finished. It was an incredibly early time, right? And the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire, had finished 500 years before, right? It was the same. Renovatio Imperii was something pretty early, right? But pretty recent. But I mean, that is already the ideology that is supporting morally the secular rulers, so the emperors themselves. Because as Christ ruled in heaven, so the emperor reigned on earth. As a king, and from his faithful princes, almost always the principal political concern for the court, there was constituted a sole imperial framework. That is the corporatist theory of the imperii corpus, as Frederick II phrased it in 1235, right? So in a very different situation 200 years later, when, as we were saying before, actually the public authority of German kingship was going downhill completely, but still a broader idea, and especially in Frederick II's mind, it was definitely one of the greatest minds of his time, properly in this universal understanding of the Romanity of the empire and the complexity of the same empire, in fact, itself. So the imperii corpus, so properly the body of the empire, so all the various limbs, all the various lands, all the various communities had to cooperate. And this brings us back to regionalism, right? And because at that point it was evident that princely power was so strong that, in fact, as before, but never as much as before, the imperial authority depended on it, which is, as we've seen, not really a positive thing, and the current events were proving it. But this character was specifically German in nature, right? The German kingship and the Neo-Roman Empire were, let's say, there to, if you want to manage that reality, to constantly dialogue with those communities, to find a solution. There is a difference between regimen and jurisdictio. We'll have to make a video about that. Properly, the idea that at a local level, there are some rights, some of which are properly inalienable de facto, such as the allodium. Think about, I don't know, Henry the Lion, that was taken out by Frederick II. He had to escape in exile, etc. But his allodium in Saxony was not really confiscated, because that, all the other princes in the empire would have rebelled, right? It's something that not even the emperor could really do anything about. Even the struggle between Barbarossa and Henry the Lion is a bit, took some kind of, if you want, archetypical interpretational form. It wasn't really a great hostility or will of Barbarossa to take out that ruler, that there was such a great competition for the crown itself, right? There were other things at stake, including the support of the church. It was being aggressed by Henry the Lion in some areas in northern Germany, and that it doesn't matter that the church did the same thing against each other or with other princes, but Barbarossa could not just ignore that. But that's just an example. The regimen instead is properly the regime, right? So the empire, right? The idea that the imperium holds, right? That's what the term means. Control as a if you want, temporarily, right? Because as long as there is a local jurisdiction, things are fine, right? These are all common law countries in medieval times, right? Aside from the Roman law that is recovered exactly by the Holy Roman Emperors, but there is no way to enforce it as a standard thing, right? The thing there is a mix, and it's mostly common law, which says essentially that the rights of the people pre-exist, are natural ones, and therefore they pre-exist the empire. Then the empire is just called to preserve them as such, not to interfere with them. So that's the idea. The idea is that the imperium has to act as a benefic force over the communities to protect them, primarily in a pacifying sense, because the Christian world should never rise arms against one another. And in spite of what is commonly thought, even though they were doing it for pragmatic reasons, the papacy, also the emperors for that matter, were doing an enormous work of civilization to pacify this world. I mean, these two authorities, there is a lot of anti-clericalism and theophobia around, but even when it takes the imperial policy, people they're paranoid because lots of people are also obsessed with imperialism, and everything is behind it. There's imperialism behind the corner. As I was saying at the beginning, it's not really a bad thing. Like civilizations, places worth of the dignity of human goodness are usually advanced, pacified places where there is a strong public authority that allows people to live freely. That is essentially what we have strived to obtain, historically speaking, right? So people who do not like a strong rule by itself. One thing that is not democratic. The thing is whether it's infringing someone's pre-existing rights, but by itself is a positive thing, right? It's really what you should wish for in a normal society. Orthodoxy, the majority of the people, civilization revolves around this, right? Then you need in human communities the fringe. There is always a kind of Manichaean, communistic, radical one that really couldn't go anywhere, because every time it takes over, it basically transforms itself in the oppressive orthodoxy, let's say. But because there's no other way to rule human beings, right? But again, the core must be pacified, must be civilized, which means that if somebody thinks that they can go out there, infringing someone else's civil rights, they should be broken, severely from a physical point of view. And this is the nature of the empire. It's deterrence, right? Which is a purely military concept. It's a strategical. It's an element of strategic culture. It is to say you have to make people fear the physical annihilation of whoever dares to destabilize a freely elected system that is capable of maintaining that order, because otherwise it's not a free regime at all, right? Of course, as we all know, the greatness of civilization increased the more the military capacity increased, right? This is the great lesson of military history, that we don't make less war because we are more civilly advanced. This is a culturalist bullshit that is frankly just racist in nature, because there is no other way, any other way to justify it otherwise, and that people buy in just because they don't like really to obey the law and would always like to carve their mafia-like harbor to do whatever the shit they want. And this is not really a civilized principle. And so that's why, a secular rule and a spiritual rule are a big deal, because a spiritual rule has also to provide the moral values, the moral standards, the education, the individual responsibility, the freedom of conscience, that, in other words, didn't quite exist as such, right? And I argue that this split could have, like papacy and empire, could have not but happened at that time in history, properly made. And that there's a big deal of modernity and of advancement and of positivity in these two figures that do not quite exist anymore, right? And that are, for that matter, in fact, quite wished for in a sense, I guess, by many. Some people are scared by such things because they say, well, they could abuse of their power. In fact, they would, right? So you should always be scared by such things, but you cannot do things that do not own a moral. They do not own a moral weight if you want to achieve something moral. Right, and this is also one of the greatest, if not the greatest lesson in history, right? That remaining entrenched in your own shell, in your own safe space, and because you fear that somebody could feel a displeasing feeling. Well, that's a declaration of a deeply rooted moral, civil, and educational inferiority. That is what we should eradicate from any assessment of human rights, for the assessment of human rights, for the assessment of civilization, for the assessment of what the world should be as a righteous place, right? And this is exactly what the empire was built for, right? Maintaining a control on the capacity to stem any relativistic degradation and lack of moral principles that would animate the same possibility of enforcing law and rights and justice, right? And this was a hell of a challenge in a world that was thinking, of course, that human history was inexorably turning towards the apocalypse. Orbis senescit. The world is aging, is going down. This was the Christian view, that things would go always worse. Before the come of Christ, Satan has to rule the earth. Right? So much that even, at the time, for the atrociously bitter fights that occurred, Frederick II was thought to be Satan himself, right? And there is one of the most famous authors in, medieval history, Salim Bennett of Harman, that stated, I believe that, because this was a Joachimite belief. There were all these prophecies about, in fact, Frederick is the Antichrist, etc. And so when Satan would have died, Christ would have come, the end of time. Instead, Frederick died, and the world went on. And so Salim Bennett says, you know what, I was wrong. This is how deeply these people were taking, and how seriously they were taking their moral burden and responsibility. They were literally believing that this was the case. So from an imperial perspective, realizing that in theory things would have had to go fundamentally wrong, unavoidably, was, essentially a self-sacrifice, was the idea that no matter what, but you had to struggle against, ultimately with Satan, in order to enforce law and justice, right? And consider this a perspective, eschatological, like in a world that also had a very different view of time and history the way we do, These people had, if we want, a much shorter term, interest that they thought to be kind of more central to the reality, because they took much more seriously, from a moral point of view, these rules, right? Infringing imperial law. Of course, it was all over the place, right? But at the same time, it was taken much more seriously. It seems a nonsense, right? It seems an oxymoron, a paradox, but it's really not, right? And that's what kept alive civilizationally in this debate. Such things like the papacy in an empire, right? When we look at those things, and the fact that I made a video about the decline of the universal powers and the rise of modernity, in a sense, and even of the nation as the center of political reference, if you want, we are witnessing essentially how people saw the world before, in terms of a dramatically greater individual moral commitment as it existed since ancient times, because these were much more primitive and violent times where if people failed, they literally died. So if you explain a kid today that's just come out of school, what is the papacy in the empire, of course they don't even know what you're talking about, and that's how low that moral capacity has sunk to arrive to that point. It's because properly they don't have any civilizational or moral or educational capacity anymore. Those people back in the day, they had, because they understood the difference it made on their own skins, right? It was quite practical in nature, but it was much more easily identifiable from a moral point of view. So this is interesting, because when you study medieval history chronologically as a spectrum, you see that this thing is dying out, and therefore most of the things that we see also happening in our world today, and the thing is accelerating, is, if you want, a tearing down, an ever more tearing down of that moral capacity. It really does, that cultural background, that legacy, that moral responsibility. Maybe it is true that we're heading towards the apocalypse in this sense, with a worsening our moral capacity, denying our own humanity from the fact that we are not held responsible for anything anymore. Not even things like homicide or racism, or even when this is clothed with something else, people just believe in it because they don't make the effort to understand it anymore. This is exactly what is happening in today's policy. People believing blindly what they're told, presuming to have a shortcut of sanctity and salvation. They are going straight to hell because they have completely surrendered their conscience to something else. This is properly what Satan is meant to be biblically, and so sociologically, politicologically, we're witnessing this quite clearly, right? This is the main concern of social studies at this point, right? There is an urge to fix the problem, because we're realizing that the world has becoming so complex and so powerful that we are in parallel we're regressing in terms of mental capacities, properly in a motivational sense, because that's the moral background we're talking about, and we don't have we don't know how to make the world work anymore. In the 11th century, in the High Middle Ages, let's say, around these centuries, they knew so much that they could make a universal empire, even with all its limits, but existing in a world that didn't even know modern physics, or that didn't even have, of course, the statal structures as we mean it in contemporarily speaking. They would make it because they believed in it. They had faith in it because they knew what difference it made. Right? So, as always, this is not just a prerogative of political history of medieval Germany, let's say, but a bit of all rulers of the time, right? It's this extended dialogue between regional dynamics and the convergent or unifying ideal of the king reigning under divine providence, right? And that was embodied almost as an immortal hypostasis by the Roman imperial crown and the scepter in itself, and more concretely by the sword, right? And so there was unequivocally, we have seen this in history of religions very much, the need for the excellence and virtue of imperial majesty for the government of the empire. That is to say, God could not provide with the imperium, because no human power exists but through divine endowment. No empire could work if the majesty, so the greatness, the capacity, the leadership, right, had not been excellent and virtuous. Right, a couple of millennia before, literally, they believed that even if you had told a lie, the divine glory of the sky would have not fallen on you with her wings, right, and you would have collapsed. These people would have felt doomed if something had happened. Naturally, the world was something else, but the way they would think it, they would interact, they would even speak, was very, very different from our own, where we do not attribute, in fact, that anymore, that due moral and scientific assessment, like they would do their own way at the time, right? And there is a beautiful passage from a provision of Frederick Barbarossa, dated to 1174, that is quite eloquent in it. So translating would be, the office of Our Majesty is entrusted to us by God to maintain to everyone what is his by right, and to remedy injury through rendering judgment and by the mercy of imperial authority. And this is one of the most beautiful passages you can read from this political theory of Holy Roman imperial nature. Right here it says, Our Majesty, so the majesty in itself, right, so that this greatness is entrusted to us by God as an office, properly. It's something that God created for us, right, for us to be worthy of it, right, to maintain everyone what is his by right. Do you understand what this means? It means that in every situation you have to be awake of what is your true right, not what you wish to cripple other people like for your own interest or whatever. You have to do something that is righteous at the core, and that you should be tormented constantly by determining. Not like today where everybody thinks that they know what it is, right? No, today it's the complete denial of that. It's completely opposite to that. Right, and to remedy injury through rendering judgment, right? So exercising justice and fixing the problems, and so to recompose the order, the stability, the health of this community, and by the mercy of imperial authority. Is to say, imperial authority doesn't just have to be violent; it has to be just. Right, so this is almost a Clausewitz, actually a Clausewitzian concept. That is to say, indeed, war, violence is just a continuation of politics with other means. War is truly an instrument of policy and nothing else. That is to say, the imperium must be acted upon, must be addressed to the concrete capacity. And this is not just anecdotal or theoretical, because when you had to launch a major expedition with tens of thousands of men to bring order to another land, and you would have sinned like hell, right? You would have spilled that blood in rivers. You had to carry this out with an intelligence and a capacity, a strategical vision, and a definition of objectives. It would have been enormous. So every defeat, every burden, every impediment would have seen as a great form of divine judgment over your work, right? And this would have been interpreted as such as by all Christendom, and therefore it would have been like helped to rule in this reality. But so it was at the time, and they were under this pressure all along. This is what we don't understand quite concretely anymore. That this is all one with political education, strategic culture, right? And if you don't study history, you cannot arrive to understand how far we have turned, we have come from that. All right, so for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.